Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Gönül Tol. I'm the Senior Fellow with MEI's Frontier Europe Initiative, and I'm the Director of MEI's Turkey Program. I'm pleased to welcome you to today's event to discuss the recent developments in eastern Ukraine. According to the EU estimates, more than 100,000 Russian troops had amassed near the border, as well as in Crimea, which was annexed by Russia in 2014. It is the largest Russian military buildup since 2014. And after weeks of tension, Russia's defense minister recently ordered a number of units in the area back to their bases. So what do these developments mean? Where do regional states stand and the United States stand? Where do we go from here? So to answer these questions, I'm joined by a great group of panelists. We have General Philip Bridlov. He is the distinguished chair of MEI's Frontier Europe Initiative. General Bridlov was the Supreme Allied Commander Europe and also the commander of US European Command. Thank you, General. And we have Yörük Işık. He is a non-resident scholar at the Middle East Institute's Turkey program. Thank you, Yörük. And we have Yulia Joja, who is a senior fellow and Frontier Europe Initiative, and Mamuka Tsereteli, who is a non-resident scholar, again, at the Middle East Institute's Frontier Europe Initiative. I look forward to taking audience questions through Zoom's Q&A feature. So please, and you can find that on all on your screens, and feel free to ask a question at any time. Throughout the panel, I'll do my best to look at your questions and will factor as many as possible into the discussion. Once again, thank you so much for making the time to join us today. I'm really looking forward to this discussion. So I would like to start with Mamuka to get a sense of Russian thinking. Mamuka, you follow Russia closely. When Russia started massing troops on the Ukrainian border, many people thought that Putin was going to repeat the Crimean scenario to bolster his position at home, because his personal support is waning and his ruling party faces elections in September. So, and looking at the Russian decision to annex Crimea, which was widely supported by Russian public, one could think that escalating tensions with Ukraine could bolster his support. So I want to ask you, what was Putin's thinking when he ordered the military buildup along the Ukrainian border?
Thank you, Gönül. Greetings to everyone. Let me give you a little bit of maybe context, operational sort of context, political, geopolitical context of all these developments in the last couple of months, which, as you said correctly, it's a largest military buildup of forces in Black Sea area, probably since the end of the Cold War. So since January 2021, there was a reporting on increased escalation of military activities on front lines, separating Ukrainian government forces from the separatist forces supported by Russia. For the full picture, it is important to understand that really sniper activities and skirmishes and killings of Ukrainian soldiers on the front line never stopped since 1994. So it's not that there was no activities like that in the past, but obviously it started to escalate in January. It is also true that reporting on those incidents started to increase as well this year. So that was, including in Western media. So that was also a factor here. In February, in response to some of the escalation, Ukrainian government made a very significant decision to sanction several TV stations, pro-Moscow TV stations, associated with the personal friend of President Putin, Mr. Viktor Medvedchuk, and his For Life party. And later, also, he personally was sanctioned, and high-level US Ukrainian officials actually made statements about his involvement in some of the funding of terrorist activities. And as we know, Putin takes this type of actions by foreign governments as related to his personal friends and supporters very personally. So it's also important to mention that pipeline that Mr. Medvedchuk owns that connects, it's all product pipeline that connects Ukraine with Western countries, mostly using Russian oil products. Also, decision was made to take this pipeline back to the Ukrainian government from Medvedchuk's hands. In parallel to these developments, there was a planned visits of NATO troops and US warships to the Black Sea, mostly warships, NATO warships and US warships to the Black Sea, continued in January and March. Those are all pre-planned activities, but this factor was used in internal communication by Russian government, President Putin and others in advance to build up of military forces in around Ukraine. In fact, it's interesting that some Western media representatives were allowed to visit troops and report on their movements. I mean, Russian troops, and report on their movements. It's clearly Russian intent to amplify the message to rest of the world about mighty military operations that we are planning. Again, having in mind that some of the activities that were taking place in the Black Sea. So in this late March, most of April, this unprecedented buildup suggested an intent for military actions to gain significant territories, ensuring direct land access to Crimea and maybe taking Odessa or some of other territories east of the Dnipro River. Objectives could be most important military success of the Russian Federation since the end of the Cold War, signaling the West about the red lines of Russia for Western military security presence in Russian neighborhood. Also, demonstration of the incapacity of the West to deal with Russia and protect interests of the rest of Western allies. And also, obviously, as you mentioned in the beginning, the huge popularity boost potentially domestically. After decision to pull out forces last week, the internal communication of President Putin and his inner circle is interesting to kind of observe and watch. They say that Russia has its own red lines, which include Russia will not tolerate military security presence of NATO in the areas of strategic interests of Russia. Later, we can talk about concept of strategic borders of Russia. And actually, Black Sea and if not entirely, at least significant part of Black Sea is included in that strategic border. We can follow up on that later on if we have question on this. And also, this means that no NATO membership for Ukraine and Georgia. For Russia, it's a red line. Another red line is Russia will not tolerate any attempt to change existing status quo in Donbass in favor of Ukraine and Ukrainian territorial integrity unless Russia decides to do that. Russia achieved its goals. It's, again, internal communication of Russian government and President Putin himself and some of his inner circle. Russia achieved its goals in Ukraine for now without using force. Russia had to use force to achieve some of the similar goals in Georgia in 2008. Again, they say it openly that they didn't need to use military force because they achieved their goal. Russia has its own understanding of the concept of sovereignty. And I think I call it personally, I call it asymmetric sovereignty because whatever is allowed for Russia is not allowed to other countries in terms of their own territorial integrity and so forth. So they stress on that Russia has its own concept of sovereignty, different from what other countries are allowed. And also Putin is recommending in his annual statement, as well as some other occasions, he recommends Western countries to understand and study carefully what Russian positions on its red lines are, and to have conversation about that if they are willing to, but there are red lines that Russia will enforce. So what are the gains of Russia after these operations from my perspective? Again, demonstration of force and the strong intent to use that force if needed. Demonstration of lack of coherent Western strategy. I think we saw that. More fear in Germany and like-minded countries that membership of NATO for Ukraine or Georgia is a threat to their security. Military equipment stays in Crimea and border areas of Russia, and while personnel is no longer there, I mean, it could be easily brought back. So that is also strategic gain, probably, or at least tactical gain of Russia. and increased ability to harm economic interests of Ukraine. I know my colleagues will elaborate on these last two points going forward. Again, what are the losses of Russia? This is from my perspective, based on what some of the Russian observers are looking, some of the Russian observers looking at these issues. More consolidation of Ukrainian nation against Russian aggression. This is a factor. Confidence of Ukrainians that Russia could start this military escalation, but without really ability to ever end it. So more force in Ukraine, Georgia and Black Sea security from the US and NATO are probably expected, more focus on Ukraine, Georgia and Black Sea security from the US and NATO. That's also a loss of Russia from my perspective, including focus on economic security in the Black Sea, of the Black Sea nations in general, and potential harm to its own economic interest in Black Sea region. That also probably a loss of Russia. I'll stop here and maybe we can have some follow-up questions later.
Just one follow-up on that, because you talked about the domestic angle. I mean, how this could, again, the majority of Russian society backed what Russia did in Crimea in 2014. But on the other hand, I've been looking at recent polls that suggest that public support for foreign military intervention has been waning, including Russian intervention in Syria. Is that the case? So is public support as strong for what Putin might do in Ukraine as it was for Crimea? If you could answer very briefly.
I mean, in general, current standing of Putin in public opinion polls is less than he usually has. But it was done before this military operation and withdrawal of forces. I think we still need to see what are the results of maybe this week or next week polls in order to understand exactly how this entire operation affected Russian public opinion. But the fact that he did not focus too much on foreign affairs in his State of the Union address is a factor. He spent less time than he usually does on foreign relations, but in my opinion, his message, at least his intended message and the force that he delivered that message was clear, and I think we should listen what he said at that statement.
Yulia, I want to turn to you next. Ukrainian President Zelensky, he welcomed the troop withdrawal, but he said that the situation still remained dangerous. And a few days ago, he invited Putin to hold talks in Donbass, and Putin responded to the invitation by suggesting that Zelensky could discuss the Donbass issue with the leaders of the two self-proclaimed republics, the LPR, adding that you talk to them and we're happy to talk to you on other matters. So my question to you is, what are Zelensky's options? Because he also called for a revamp of the 2015 accord, which was intended to bring peace to Donbass region with a bigger diplomatic role for the West. And as a follow-up, what has been the response from Europe?
Thank you, Gunu, for your questions, and thank you for hosting this. This is kind of a two-tiered question in terms of Zelensky and Ukraine on one side, what their options are, and then on the other side, what the response has been from the West overall, especially if we focus on Western Europe and its support of Ukraine over the last 7 years since the annexation of Crimea and the war in Donbass. And I think here, if we focus on Ukraine in the first row, we have a specific problem in terms of framing the problem, right? Russia in the buildup has been, and over the last 7 years, has been very skilled in pointing fingers at Ukraine, blaming Ukraine for trespassing of the red lines, blaming Ukraine for what Mamuka mentioned very importantly, what is going on domestically with Medvedchuk. And for our understanding here in the West, it is a problem in terms of how we understand Russia's actions towards Ukraine and the possibility of Ukraine responding to them. First of all, when we talk about red lines in Russia are changing, and Putin said that recently, according to what he wants. Like we say in American English, changing the goalpost. So that's not something that Ukraine can really respond to. And then also in the larger picture, we talk about a country, medium-sized country, but tiny compared to Russia, that has been waging a war to protect its own territory for the last 7 years. And yet, when we think about it from a Western perspective, we still wrap our head around the fact that over the last 30 years, Russia in the early 90s, in 2008 in Georgia, in 2014 in Ukraine, in 2018 in Azov Sea, in 2020 in Nagorno-Karabakh, Syria, not to mention, but just in its neighborhood, has been foreignly intervening and has been far more aggressive than in foreign affairs and in foreign action than it has before the end of the Cold War. Let's not forget that the second foreign intervention of Russia or then the Soviet Union in the Cold War, Afghanistan, ended up with them losing the Cold War. But now here in the West overall, and especially when it comes to Western Europe, we see that the blame is being, or the attention is being focused on Ukraine and President Zelensky, and the response that the West has is inconsistent with the reality. So back to your question, Gunur, very briefly, President Zelensky is in a very difficult position. First of all, because of the conflict, and then in the context of COVID, of the pandemic, of the lack of support from the West, and of his limited possibilities of actions. We know, thank God, that he's not a free rider and that he will be listening and not doing aggressive actions to kind of poke the Russian bear. But beyond that, his actions in terms of what he can do is very limited, and he is forced to be relying on the West. Now, I know that we're going to focus the conversation in a few minutes more on the United States, because we all know that in the end, it depends on the United States with their political support to be able to foster Western support overall for Ukraine. But for Zelensky, indeed, you pointed that out correctly. He's been trying to find a diplomatic solution. That's how he came to power, with an impossible problem of finding a diplomatic solutions for the Donbass specifically. And now he has to rely on his Western partners. And this brings me then to my final point in this context, and that is his call for a reconfiguration of generally the negotiation format. We are now in a situation on Western Europe where we have what we call the Normandy format and the Minsk agreements, where the power is being negotiated and the situation is being negotiated by France and Germany. If we look at the latest over just the last few months on France and Germany on Russia, we see that President Macron at the Munich Security Conference, the most important European security conference of the year, called for strategic dialogue with Russia. We know that in Germany, Chancellor Merkel, who has been the one that has been keeping sanctions in place despite domestic pressure with all the issues around it, is leaving. And we see now over the last few days how even in Germany and all around Western Europe, there's still a discussion about should we help Ukrainians with weapons to defend their territory at all, or if so, then only defensive. When we're talking about a country that has been invaded and is trying to get the military capabilities to be able to at least limit that invasion. So with that undecisiveness in Germany itself, the foreign minister opposing, I think it was today, the delivery of German weapons to Ukraine, defensive and non-offensive. With France with a constant position of trying to find strategic dialogue, and none of them all over Europe, in the West generally, acknowledging that we have a situation that is escalating on the ground and that will continue to be an aggression in a form or another, whether a hybrid or a strictly conventional military one. To wrap up, President Zelensky is in a very difficult position. He cannot do much on the ground with Russia. He's been trying, and he cannot do much with the support that he currently has from the West in finding a diplomatic solution to the problem in the Donbass.
General Breedlove, I want to turn to you next against the background of what Yulia just said about Europe. Europe's in many ways not so effective response. So first let me start with what is at stake for the United States, and what has been the response from Washington to Russian actions so far? And maybe here I could also incorporate a question from the audience, which says, given the fact that we should not really expect anything substantial from the EU, how far do you expect the US president to go?
So first of all, Nurul, thank you for putting this on. It's a great event, and I'm glad to be on the stage with some great scholars and thinkers about this business. And I think that Mamuka and Yulia really set me up well for the answer. I like much of what Mamuka said, and I keyed on his points of there is a lack of consistent Western strategy. And so I'll roll that into my answer. And then Yulia also talked about inconsistent actions with reality when it comes to what's happening. And the President Zelensky calling for a reformat of negotiations. In other words, as we have said consistently now for some time, the Minsk approach and Normandy formats have failed. We haven't made any progress on returning sovereign Ukrainian lands to Ukraine. The border still belongs to Russia and is held by Russian troops. And so we need to get on with it. So what is at stake for the United States, and what should we be doing in the question of not expecting much from the EU? I think the most important thing that's at stake is, in my opinion, this is my opinion, for over 12 years now, the United States has been backing off of the leadership stage in some of these parts of the world. And we see some pretty interesting results everywhere from Syria to North Africa to the Black Sea. And I think what's at stake now with this new administration, who has talked so firmly about reestablishing relationships with our alliances, with our alliance partners and allies, and reestablishing leadership, now is the test. Will America be again at the table leading? Will America be a part of the solution in Ukraine when it comes to a Minsk and Normandy failure? Will America lead the West or bring leadership to the West to try to address some of these questions that both Mamuka and Yulia have brought up? And I don't know that the question, the person asking the question is correct. I would not write off the EU, and I would not write off NATO. I think we just need strong leadership from some of the traditional Western leaders to step up and rally. We're going to talk later, I think, about strategy, but you tell me, do we have a strategy in the Black Sea? Does our government have one? I think there's a lot of work to be done there and a lot of good to be done there.
Excellent. Yörük, I would like to turn to you now because you're based in Turkey. You follow Turkish politics, Turkish regional policy, security policy very closely. Turkey is an important country in the Black Sea, and Erdogan was forced to walk a fine line between countering Russian aggression in the Black Sea and not alienating Moscow. So let me first ask you this: how worried is Erdogan about the balance of power in the Black Sea, which has changed dramatically in favor of Russia since 2014? And what are some of the steps that Ankara has taken to counter that?
I think he's very worried about it because in 2016, as we all remember, he actually was calling for more NATO presence. Since 2016, the domestic politics in Turkey, policies in Turkey has taken different turns. So he's not making that call anymore so openly, but the desire is definitely there. And these last events, I wanna also add on what Mamuka said, and which it kind of connects probably how Ankara is seeing this event, is that what the Russians did in Crimea or in Donbass in the last 1 month. I think, you know, there was never a desire to annex Donbass, etc. You know, it's just Donbass is already looted, all its assets, all its factories are gone, and there isn't the emotional romantic connection Russians have, you know, like the Crimea, you know, it's like you see it in the most highest level, the Prince Vladimir, the Kiev Rus, etc. Like there is a story is created around Crimea. Donbass is not a place like that. What Russians really did, they brought all their assets. They brought the 41st Battalion, 56th Battalion, they bought the Central District and the Southern District armies were mobilized. And this wasn't just 120,000 people coming. They brought their planes, they brought their paratroopers, they moved logistics, and which is actually kind of like, it goes to the question that came to the general also. NATO maybe is not really upfront right now, like it's not in people's mind, but NATO created this very high readiness joint task force. And maybe this is not really noticed in the NATO countries, but it's really noticed in Moscow. And what they really, really did, and what they really, really wanted to show to us, that the Russian army is ready, it's mobile, and it can move more than just the numbers of the assets, etc. they have, which they always, you know, they say we bought, you know, 100 new ships and, you know, so many planes, etc. And they showed some of this to us. And they have very strong assets in Crimea, which should go to the Ankara's mind also. They have Iskander missiles, they have S-400 Triumph systems. They have really powerful assets that can hit not only the entire northern part of Turkey, most part of the Eastern Europe, but really what was going in Shoigu's mind, it is that they are not just a big group of an army that is a Cold War army that can move very slowly, and you know they are a 21st century army. They can move assets, they can create mobile command centers, and they can respond to fast developing events. So Ankara takes note all of these things. Like as you said, you know, it's just there is a big risk that Russia can claim, and Ankara now has also natural gas dreams in the Black Sea. You know, it's just this is a country in major economic crisis. So every decision here is taken based on this economic crisis, and maybe Russians will prevent Ankara some of the exploration, although it's not necessarily close to them, but you never know. All they will prevent, as we will talk maybe later on, the commercial maritime traffic in the Black Sea. So what Ankara is really afraid, of course, is that their commercial activities with Russia will get harmed at the end of this crisis, because you know this country right now is in such a foreign currency exchange crisis. Every trade, every amount of loss of trade will have a very big negative impact. But again, coming back to the adding on what Russians showed to us, at the end of the Shoigu speech, more than all the international politics, the part that really highlighted after the war games is that the draftee numbers are down and the professional Russian army soldiers number are increasing. and everyone is getting their pensions, their salaries. He talked like 5-6 minutes about the housing that the military people are getting. You know, it's like there was a very big domestic angle of the show. We saw that, and it's that is, we should not forget that when we are imagining our response to what's happening. It's not necessarily, you know, we should, I think, in my opinion, we should help Ukraine in arms, etc. And we should show some posturing, but we just need to like push them a little bit, but it doesn't necessarily, we don't need to engage them militarily, etc. Nor that they want such a thing. You know, it's just like there is major domestic angle of what's happening here. And also like just as a like at bottom of the page note, besides all these things, they have a major crisis brewing in Crimea right now. They are doing this show. Like a couple of years ago, they didn't have electricity. Now they have no water, and they bribe enough German people from Siemens, etc., to solve the electricity problem. They are totally out of water. In like Sevastopol, etc., right now there's only 5 hours of water during the daytime. So, you know, we are dealing with a country that really shows us they have a functioning army, yet there is an amazingly dysfunctional background, and they have to live with this problem. So if we actually, you know, we can, when we are thinking about how we're going to counter what they are doing, the aggressions against Ukraine or Georgia, we have to keep their weak point in mind also.
If I can,
I will stop here, maybe, yeah.
Sorry, Jörg, I just wanted to piggyback on something that I think is important to highlight, and you mentioned, and it connects to a question that we got from Alejandro from James. Thank you, Alejandro. In terms of how we can think of weakness and strength of Russia and how to calibrate our Western response. I think the military buildup and the speed of the military buildup was going back to Russia's enormous efforts after their pretty much major failures in a conflict with a small country like Georgia in 2008, which showed them that they have a massive problem with mobilization and with military reform. So then we see the Serdyukov reform that afterwards has been drilled down. That's part of the domestic, and it's part of their response and their fears, even though they are constructed in propaganda, that that the Western, the NATO response that is defensive in itself in terms of positioning in Eastern Europe is actually aggressive and goes back to military reforms and how they can face that. But the other part of that, and I'll be short with this, it goes back to the question that we had in terms of, yes, they cannot afford financially to sustain annexed territories like Crimea. Jörg's example is excellent. And if we look at what is happening in Transnistria, what is happening in Abkhazia, in South Ossetia, you can see that there is a reluctance to annex these territories because that would lead to financial burdens that Russia really cannot sustain. So they create these no-go territories of massive economic problems, in the long-term black holes of illegal trafficking and illegal activities. But much of the burden, the financial burden, is shared by the occupied countries or the West indirectly with EU funding, with NATO funding. So just to piggyback on that, I think it's important for us to understand here in the West that there's military strength, but that compensates, especially in posturing and rhetoric, with the actual problems that Russia has financially, both domestically and then in foreign positioning in these occupied territories.
Great intervention, Julia. I want to ask you the same question that I asked Jörg, which is, so where do other regional states such as Romania stand on all of this? And then I will turn to Mamuka to get his take on Georgia.
Thank you. Should I intervene now? I know General Breedlove wanted to add something on
Sure.
the military.
Please,
Yeah,
General.
just a short add on Jörg's excellent remarks. One of the things that continues to worry me is we talk sort of in past tense, like the pressure is off in Ukraine and the redeployment has started, when in fact we see really nothing of great value as far as the returning forces at this point. And if we have symbolically some troops that withdraw, but none of the equipment, the aircraft, the electronic warfare equipment, the stores and supplies, the hospitals, if these things don't redeploy, then what does the movement of a few troops mean? And so I think we need to, and I agree with all of our speakers, we need to keep our eyes on this. And I like to bring up also Yurik touched on it, the ability of Russia to move around. Classically, Jomini called this interior lines, and Russia enjoys interior lines, and they can move quickly and concentrate quickly force. And so we have to keep our eyes on that. But to your point, Yulia, about Georgia and others, the concerning thing is I do believe Russia is a learning and an adaptive opponent. They took it on the nose in Georgia. It didn't go so well, like you said. And they got better when they went into Crimea and invaded Crimea. And then when they were outed, the little green men got outed and other things got seen through early in the Crimea episode. They got even better at it when they invaded the Donbass. And so, yes, they have problems, but we see them learning and getting better. And one of the things that is left behind yet and not been addressed as far as returning things to their appropriate places is the Air Force. One of the things that we talked about, this group on Nagorno-Karabakh, is how by dominating the air, Azerbaijan dealt a tough blow to Armenia. And the Armenian armor took a hard blow from Turkish and other aircraft, drones, etc. And so what Russia has learned is that if you control the air, you control the battlefield. And so they brought a very deep bench of air superiority aircraft, multi-role aircraft, and ground support aircraft to this problem now in Ukraine. And these are things that are indicative of a learning and adaptive force. And so we need to be cognizant of that. And I think that's one of the things the West has to address. I don't want to go too long, but the West has to address the fact that right now on the ground, Russia has the capability to project air superiority into Ukraine. It has the ability to project air power in the form of ground support into Ukraine. It has the ability to project sea control into Ukraine's waters. And so all of these things are things they have learned, and we're going to have to address in the West. Sorry for that.
But General, on that point, you mentioned how Turkey's military support to Azerbaijan during the recent Nagorno-Karabakh conflict changed dynamics on the ground. And I've seen from Ukrainian analysts raising the same issue in a dangerous way. They keep talking about the Nagorno-Karabakh model where Turkey could sell drones to Ukraine, and that would empower Ukraine militarily. But that kind of rhetoric puts Turkey in a very difficult spot. At a time when President Erdogan, given his domestic vulnerabilities, is trying to walk a fine line. So I'm going to turn back to Yörük, but let me first get Yulia's take on regional responses from regional countries like Romania before I turn to Mamuka.
I think, thank you, Gunnar. I think we do see some encouraging signs, but we have to differentiate here in terms of the region between like-minded and less like-minded countries and the interference that Russia has an influence there. So, back in 2003, we were talking about New Europe when European countries were aligning or not aligning themselves with the United States in expeditionary warfare. But now we, beyond integration, we see different tiers of countries. So on one side, we see Romania, Georgia, Poland, the Baltics along the eastern flank, on both sides of the flank, really, that have been staunch supporters and with a common threat perception of Russia. And we do see countries in between that have an ambiguous position. Turkey is one of them, and in that context, a small asterisk. It is encouraging that we see now a complex cooperation between Turkey and Ukraine, specifically on drones, and that, apropos economic pressure from Russia, has got Turkey into trouble as well. If we look at the sanctions that Putin imposed, or the banning of flights that cancel the tourism over the season. So these instruments are well known to us, but nevertheless, Turkey's position on that, and other countries in different contexts, we do see that Russia is adaptable, but we also see a bit of a rallying of forces. And the best example right here is in parallel the conflict around espionage in the EU territory. We've seen over the last 2 weeks a big surprise from the Czech Republic, where traditionally the president has been with a pro-Russian stance, but we also learned that Russia is militarily interfering, poisoning, and putting deposits on fire on EU territory, and a clear response to that, and then an aligning of forces on that in Bulgaria with a similar situation, where Bulgaria, along with other countries in the region, has been ambiguous and has played an ambiguous position when it comes to Russia versus NATO in the Black Sea, with problems that came with that when it comes to NATO's presence. So we do see there a rallying of forces. When you ask me specifically about Romania, we don't there today. I think there was one diplomat expelled from Romania as well, in a show of solidarity, also accused of espionage on Romanian territory. Along with that, we see a Romanian pledge to more military cooperation with its a major neighbor, Ukraine. We see, I think Mamuka can say more of that, a show of solidarity from Georgia, even though it has limited forces and capacities to do so. So also in the way of thinking ahead and rallying support and creating more leadership, piggybacking on what General Breedlove was saying, this is a moment in which we have to, I think, do two things. On one side, reconsider based on what Russia has showed in terms of military escalation on Ukrainian border, but also in the Black Sea, that affects NATO territory, Turkey's security, and all the countries around it on one side. And on the other side, thinking about how we can coalesce forces in countries and political leadership into coalitions of the willing. I know that the term sounds negative in terms of we associate it necessarily with military intervention, but that's not what I mean by it. What I mean by it is that in the Black Sea, unlike in other regions like the Baltic Sea, we have suffered from a lack of common threat assessment. And we need to build a common threat assessment of Russia, and then start cooperating within NATO or outside NATO with partners or without, the willing and able, when it comes to putting mechanisms in place for monetarization, for whether it's military or economic security, for limiting in a non-aggressive, non-offensive way, getting support from countries in the region, Black Sea and beyond, to be able to monitor and actually diminish the impact of economic security that Russia is imposing on Ukraine, that affects the entire region and NATO beyond it, that is starting to impose on Turkey, etc. So there is, of course, much more, and I don't want to be too critical. There's, of course, much more that should have been done, much more regional leadership, much more common threat assessment, and it's been hard, but we see that in time, countries, especially in this context, we have the right momentum to reconsider both political aligning and also military reassessment of how we can respond to this in the long term.
Mamuka, Georgia has been the target of Russian aggression. Is there a Georgian strategy in place beyond seeking closer ties with the West? Does Georgia, for instance, promote regional solutions? If so, what are some of those?
First of all, I would say that Georgia is obviously much smaller actor than any of the countries we are mentioning here today during the discussion. And Georgia has also had a very negative experience dealing with Russia militarily on one-on-one sort of face-to-face basis. But for a long time now, Georgia is trying to build its security based on regional collaboration, allied with the countries that are investing in infrastructure and other projects that makes Georgia important for other actors, larger actors all around the world, including obviously United States and the United Kingdom and others, whether it's oil-related pipeline projects, Turkey, of course, pipeline projects and so forth. So Georgia sees its security in the multilateral, in the framework that put Georgia in some kind of collective security framework. In a sense, following up what just was said by Yulia, Georgia needs to be part of something big. It cannot defend itself. It can defend itself for 2 weeks, maybe for 10 days, and impose some cost to invaders. But it cannot secure its own borders or security without help and assistance or partnership. Its best scenario for Georgia is to avoid conflicts and protect itself without going into conflicts, obviously. And that can only be assured by some kind of international framework that puts Georgia into that framework. We used to have a very important mechanism of conventional forces in Europe Treaty and OSCE mechanism that were protecting countries, but it's gone now. And only really option Georgia is left with is somehow be part of the NATO or some other collective security arrangement that protects country from threats like this. In terms of Georgia and Ukrainian partnership, I mean, on emotional level, I think Ukraine is one of the probably, if not the closest, definitely one of the closest country to Georgia, and on a human level and on a country-to-country level as well. Ukrainians, we are fighting for Georgia's independence and territorial integrity in all the wars Georgia had with Russia or Russian proxies in the last 30 years. And same is happening now. Georgian citizens are fighting actually for territorial integrity of Ukraine. So there is this solidarity, obviously, very deep solidarity. And but I think both countries, we should also take into consideration that Ukraine is 10 times bigger country, and Georgia is very small, less than 4 million people, and Russian troops are in 45 kilometers from the capital, Tbilisi. So Georgia has to be at the same time be very, very cautious and calculated in response to these processes. One important element just wanted to mention that this water supply, and Europe brought very important issue. This Kakhovka water reservoir that supplies water to Crimea and some other maybe infrastructure elements there. Some experts consider that as one of the potential military targets of Russian operations. So I think Ukrainians and all the friends of Ukraine should be very careful looking at this issue, including water supply issue, because that may be, maybe I shouldn't be saying that, but that may be another pretext for Russians. They are seeking for this type of pretext, where to attack and how to justify it. So it has to be very carefully calculated how we deal with this issue. But last point is that, again, going back to your original question about partnership and solutions, I think the regional approach, whether it's economic security related projects or overall security projects and military security concepts that could somehow protect Georgia and other allies, Western allies in this region, this should be major focus of Black Sea strategy for United States, for Europeans, for NATO, and Georgia will be very loyal and significant contributor to the process, but it cannot lead the process, for obvious reasons.
General, I want to ask you, what are some of the original ideas being circulated in NATO circles or in Washington to counter Russian clout? NATO launched a multinational force in Romania after annexation of Crimea in 2014 to check the growing Russian influence presence in the region. So what are some of other ideas that is being debated? And maybe I could also ask, there's another question from the audience, which is, does US, NATO have the will to engage Russia in the information environment more directly? So that's the question. If you could answer those two questions, that would be great.
Okay. On the original ideas, I think that the key word is original. NATO has taken some actions, and I think that, as you brought up, Romania is a good example. Not only did they go into Romania initially, but Romania has grown in its support to NATO, taking on now the deployment of Reaper drones and other things that allow Romania to be a base for projecting NATO power further out into, or supporting other NATO power further out into the Black Sea. The United States, of course, has talked recently of increasing the number of ships stationed at Rota to have them available for the Eastern Med and the Black Sea. And I think that's a good initiative. One of the things I think that's a little disappointing, and we talked about it a little bit earlier, is we haven't really seen any new approaches to a strategy for the Black Sea. And I just want to take the opportunity to pat the back of this team, as the strategy that we are all working on together, I think shows great promise for at least informing governments and alliances of some things to think about. And so I think good on some of the concrete actions, maybe not the new kind of ideas, but good on some of those increased support to the area, but also an encouragement to the Western leaders and governments that we need to develop a Western strategy. And I hope that the efforts of this team and the strategy we're about to roll out will help to inform that. On the second piece of the question about the information warfare, it's a great question, and I think the asker knows that I talk about this quite a bit. So the West is doing some interesting things on information warfare. In fact, it is a NATO partner, not an ally. A NATO partner has stood up a center of excellence on information warfare, and Finland is moving forward on helping NATO to develop some of these ideas. And so some things are happening. That's the good. Now the bad. And I'm a broken record on this, but NATO only talks of defense. Mr. Putin and others are enjoying successes in information. Why would they change what they're doing if there's no cost to them to keep doing what they're doing? No world-class tennis player goes into a match and says, I'm going to receive serve for the whole engagement. And that's what we're doing in the West. We're receiving serve when it comes to information warfare. Until we return fire, until we increase the cost on Mr. Putin and others that are doing this to the West in the information spaces, why would we expect them to change? They're just going to revel in their ability to continue to do this with no cost. And so I don't advocate for disinformation like Russia, but I believe we need to be fighting back with truths, telling broadly and widely truths to attack, to return fire in these information spaces. And there's lots of truths that we could get out there about the kleptocrats who are running Russia and other places that I think could help us in these spaces.
Oh, we have a few minutes left. Yurick, I want to ask you a question about Erdogan's strategy. He recently recirculated this idea of scrapping a 1936 maritime treaty restricting foreign military presence in the Black Sea. And that statement coincided with rising tensions between Russia and Ukraine in the region. And Putin, he underscored the importance of the treaty. So is Turkey, is my question, and also Russia said that imposed some limitations to flights, which is going to hurt Turkish economy, which is not in a great state. So is Turkey's balancing act sustainable in your view? And what is the larger Turkish strategy to check the Russian influence in the Black Sea? And maybe just one more question from the audience, which talks about Turkey's close defense partnership with Ukraine, and how far is Erdogan willing to go in terms of supporting Ukraine, given the risks that it entails?
I think this is a very good point you brought up, because many people here connected the flight ban from the Russian consumer affairs specialist to Turkey due to COVID officially, to Zelensky's visit to Istanbul. But I actually thought, it was maybe connected that Turkey start talking, especially the Turkish president start talking about the Montreal Treaty and the canal. I think that was a very unhappiness, and that was kind of a little message from Moscow that this flight ban, that I will hurt you. And this, this economic, actually Russia's new, more than the military actions, the message that gives to Ukraine and to Turkey, etc., are similar in that front. I will economically hurt you, because all these countries in different ways, Turkey by directly doing trade, Ukraine in different ways, there is ways that Russia can economically really damage it. So I think there are limits to this canal project. Canal project, in my opinion, it's imaginary. Turkey is in no financial state to build a canal, nor there is any means to finance this canal, because there is no logic, maritime logic beyond it. There is the natural waterway, the Turkish straits are more reasonable. It is cheaper to navigate, and it is safer to navigate than any canal. The Montreal Treaty, it is open to discussion, yes. And actually, like in Turkey, their culture wars are in such state that nothing really gets discussed in a very functional way. Of course, a treaty can be discussed. And historically, actually, we can even say, I'm a proponent of keeping the Montreal Treaty, but Turkey usually interpret Montreal Treaty in favor of closer to Russia, let's say. I mean, it's a neutral thing, but they were more lenient with Russia. But this is the Montreal Treaty's the spirit, really. It's designed to keep this place, Black Sea, more under Russian and Turkish joint control. So now, though, the life changed so much. Turkey is in opposing Russia in so many different fronts. So despite the, all the negative feelings happen around S-400s and to the events of yesterday, etc., Turkey is actually, I will say, will be very open to create a more permanent NATO rotation in the Black Sea, some kind of NATO formation to balance the Russian power, because Turkey now understands it's the adventurous policies of this government, because maybe to distract from the domestic failures, etc. You can argue that that's a very long, separate argument. But Turkey is, opposing or working with, and at the same time, in Karabakh, in Libya, in Syria, with Russia. And we'll see that, that more NATO presence, Turkey will take the more NATO presence here, most likely under, with a big Turkish lead, let's say, because no one can match Turkish Navy's presence in the Black Sea, no other NATO member, not the other Black Sea NATO members. And because of the Montreal Treaty's limitations, like nobody else can bring submarines into Black Sea, and Turkey has one of the biggest submarine powers in NATO. Like Turkey, it's like This actually, I wanted to mention that, but it's just the discussion then gets longer and longer. In this last OPUK training area in Crimea, when Russians were doing it, they were so happily they just brought their landing ships. But most of their submarine fleet are in the Mediterranean doing jobs. Actually, in a real warfare, all those landing ships will be a very nice target. You know, if you just come without protection, you know, it's so like, it's part of what Russians showed us. It was just a show also. So I will say the time is ripe to forget some of the the unhappinesses of last 4 or 5 years. And Turkey will be very open, because right now there's no policy. Right now the policy is just to hope that Russians won't do much more aggression and things can continue as it is. And I will just do more and more trade with everyone. And I can engage with Ukraine on the defense industries to fulfill some of the gaps created because of my domestic policy shortcomings, that I cannot purchase everything I want, and I can get most of these things from the Ukraine because it's a perfect match. This policy has limitations. It's too rosy. It is just like everything going just so right at all times, and it's working. But just to the audience question, yes, Ukraine and Turkey are really a very good match, both economically and who's producing what, who's doing what. You know, like Turkey cannot produce engines, Ukrainians produce engines, Ukrainians need UAVs, Turkey makes UAVs, etc., etc. You know, there is a good match there that can they can build on. Plus, there is the Crimean Tatars issue. Although this government really always tiptoes around any kind of minority issue if it's not for them, like nobody mentions the Chinese Uyghurs. Crimean Tatars are always like a little bit on the, you know, like nobody wants to offend Russians. But so there is this kind of domestic angle also. But I will say the moment Russians, and I know I should wrap up, the moment Russians get more upset and they try to disrupt more of the commercial merchant traffic and in the Black Sea, and they will do it. They are giving the signs. They declare this crazy NAVTEX. They close most of around the Crimea for 6 months of naval war games. This is loony. There's no other word to it. Nobody organizes 6 months of war games. So they can block anytime they want. Chornomorsk, Pivdevny, Odessa, you know, Berdyansk, they can block any of these routes, and not into the Azov Sea. You know, they already control the Kerch Strait, but like into the west of the Crimean Peninsula. There is a very small island, and there is a rig. You know, there were other oil rigs there. They from the Chornomor Naftogaz, Ukrainian gas. They stole you know, when they invaded Crimea, they literally stole the rigs. They brought another old rig there, and it's really like a Mad Max movie. On the rig there is Russian special forces, and there is a 27-mile stretch in the Western Black Sea. The entire international maritime shipping lane passes. And Russians can pretty much actually block that very easily if they want. They can even block Odessa and Chornomorsk. Okay, the ships can go closer to the Romanian coast, but those are more shallow waters, etc. It will cause more maritime problems. So like they can anytime they want. They're unhappy with Turkey. We will see not only they are blocking Ukrainian ships, etc. They will find ways, like they will go safety searches on Turkish ships. They already do it. They will arrest ships, etc. And they will cause more commercial chaos. So I think Turkey, for the power balance games, will like to lead at this point. To show Russians, I have other friends and I have other means to balance your power here. And when I'm doing here, you have to pay more attention. You have to be nicer to me in Sahel or in the Caucasus, etc., etc.
Well, unfortunately, this has been a fascinating discussion, but we ran out of time. But those who are interested in what the West can do to help Ukraine, Yulia recently wrote an excellent piece for The Hill, and the link, I believe, has been shared on the Q&A site here. So please check that out. She talks about the fact that Ukraine has become a major problem, but that problem has been made worse by a lack of strategy, and she proposes some policy options. So please read that piece. And again, I would like to thank all of you. This was a great discussion. And thanks to those who watched us today, and hope to see you next time.